Hello again, everybody. This is Steve Kallas, speaking of sports, and I'm here with new contributor Johnnie Kallas, and we're going to be talking about ESPN's recent top 10 list of NBA players all time, and we're also taping this right before the final installments of the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls Last Dance. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to read you 10 through 6 from ESPN. I'm going to give you my 10 through 6 and my two honorable mentions. We've stretched it a little so we both can have two honorable mentions. And we'll have a discussion after we both do our 10 through 6, and then we'll have a longer discussion. I am happy to say right up front, I'm disappointed in the ESPN list. Any top 10 list of all time that does not have Oscar Robertson on it is, I'm sorry, flawed, and I'll just leave it at that. But to start with ESPN's, they went 10 Shaq, 9 Kobe, 8 Tim Duncan, 7 Larry Bird, 6 Wilt Chamberlain. And I'll hold my laughter on Wilt Chamberlain for now because the reason they actually said that Wilt would have been higher, but he only, and at least they put the only in quotes, won 2 championships. Maybe they forgot he played against Bill Russell and the Celtics. My honorable mentions are Shaquille O'Neal, who's number 10 on their list, and Jerry West. Again, these old-timers are kind of forgotten. I would like to say one thing about Pistol Pete Maravich, because one guy said he shouldn't be in the top 100, and I'll just say this. He has an argument, but Pistol Pete Maravich is the greatest ball handler who ever lived, period. He's the greatest passer who ever lived, period. But he had he had a really good NBA career, but not a superstar NBA career. I just think Pistol Pete should at least be mentioned. So now I'll give you my 10 through 6. Duncan, Bill Russell, Kobe, Magic, and Larry Bird. And the reason I put Kobe above Magic and Larry Bird is for defensive purposes. So let me repeat those. Duncan, Russell, Bird is 8, Magic 7, Kobe 6. I gave the order incorrectly. I apologize. But Tim Duncan's the greatest power forward ever. You know, they have him 8th. I don't want to quibble. 19 points, 11 rebounds a game, 5 championships. In the ESPN analysis, they say his only problem was he was boring. And that really, frankly, galls me because he's really the kind of guy you like to see play. When you have kids growing up, you would point to them to Tim Duncan. Greatest nickname ever, given to him by Shaq, the big fundamental, and that kind of describes his game. First he was with David Robinson, and then eventually he was part of the big three, of course, with Ginobili and Tony Parker. But to me, he was the biggest of the big three. He's my number 10. Bill Russell is 9. If this was who's the greatest winner of all time in any sport, it would be Bill Russell, 11 championships in 13 tries. Greatest defensive player ever. I know defense doesn't get as much pub as offense. And people will look at his 15 points a game and say, well, he only averaged 15 points a game. But I think as a game changer, now he did play with 7 Hall of Famers, which maybe is why I have him a little lower than some people. But he is one of the greatest players of all time. I put Bird at 8 right behind Magic. They kind of come together. But Bird was incredible, a 3-time champion. He won 3 MVPs in a row. I think the only other guys to do it, I haven't looked at the recent, but Russell did it, Chamberlain did it, maybe somebody else, maybe LeBron did it, I'm not sure, but it's a rare feat. Larry Bird was one of the greatest passing big men of all time. No, he couldn't jump out of the building, but he still averaged 10 rebounds a game for his career. And yes, to me, he had one of the quickest first steps ever. And if you watch any Bird tape, he's not fast from point A to point B. He can't jump out of the gym, but he's one of the smartest players ever, one of the greatest shooters ever. If he shot 3-pointers today, then like they shoot him today, obviously his numbers would have been better. It really wasn't viewed to be the shot it is today. Great competitor, 3 championships, et cetera, et cetera. I put Magic in front of Bird because although I think Oscar was Magic before Oscar, and we'll get into that later, he was the 6'9" point guard. He did get to play with one of the 3 or 4 or 5 greatest players of all time in Kareem. And I really think that's kind of what made those Lakers super Lakers. And of course, they had a lot of other good players. But Magic was an incredible passer. I think second all time to Pete Maravich. Maybe no one will agree with me. Doesn't matter to me. And the reason I put Kobe above Bird and Magic is because Kobe was an incredible defensive player. 5 championships, all with the Lakers. First 3 with Shaq. The other 2 with, pretty incredible, I thought, Pau Gasol maybe. And so Kobe defensively, to me, great scorer. 80, had an 81-point game. Everybody kind of knows all his stats and stuff. But I think it was defense that made me put him over. And frankly, because of Bill Russell's lack of offense, I kind of moved Russell down a little. And of course, people will disagree with that. But that's my 6 through 10 in honorable mentions. How about you, Johnny Kallas?
Steve, good to be with you. I've been looking forward to this for a little bit. Maybe unsurprisingly, we have similar but not equivalent lists, so it'd be interesting to get into the distinctions between them. For honorable mention, I have Kevin Durant, as I think he really is the guy most likely to get onto this list with another NBA title if he can win one with the Nets and come back from his injuries. I think he's one of the most dominant scorers of all time, and I think that he'll get onto this list in the 10 spot. I also have Tim Duncan as an honorable mention. I believe we might have talked about this when we were thinking of this idea a couple of days ago, that there's really 11 guys on the top 10 list. And it's, you chose Shaq to be your honorable mention. I choose Duncan to be off the list. It's really close. He's a big fundamental. He's really the symbol of the Spurs dynasty, which I think often gets overlooked when we think of dynasties in NBA history, even though it's so recent. They, won 5 championships in less than 20 years. They had almost, to use an NFL equivalent, a Patriots-like level of dominance for that entire time, even though the leagues are very different. So Tim Duncan, incredible, greatest power forward of all time. He barely misses my top 10. I'll give you quickly just 10 through 6, and then I'll go through each. Number 10, I have Shaq. Number 9, I have Larry Bird. Number 8, I have Magic. Number 7, I have Russell. Number 6, I have Kobe. So the reason I get Shaq in at number 10 and why I think he's ahead of Duncan is just when I think of the greatest, players, I just have, as much as I love Duncan, the way he played, I just have Shaq higher. He just was that much more dominant, in my opinion. He's the second most dominant player ever to play the game, I think. I think he's a distant second to Wilt, who we'll talk about later, but I think he's the second most dominant player to ever play the game. And I just think he's in that top 10, not only with the Lakers and obviously one with the Heat, but just look at some highlights from those first couple of years with the Magic. Just a unique, we won't see another player like Shaq again, and I think he's number 10. KD could replace him in a few years, but for now I have Shaq. Number 9, I have Larry Bird. You summarized Bird a lot better than I probably could, but I know that he was the ultimate trash talker, incredible shooter. I do want to point out Bird, like a few other guys, I'll make this point later when we wrap up too. I think Bird is one of the 3 or 4 guys on this list who are undoubtedly the best player on their team for their entire career, which I think is really interesting to think about. I think Larry Bird did play with 2 other Hall of Famers that obviously helped him to some of his championship appearances and three titles, but I think he was undoubtedly the best player on those 80 Celtics. I then have Magic. The reason I have Magic over Bird is I think he had a little bit more help with Kareem, obviously. Both played with a couple Hall of Famers. But he really, it was showtime, right? And I think it just changed the game. Having a 6'9" point guard, I think, revolutionized the game. Playing center in the finals, stepping in for Kareem. I believe it was a Game 6 clincher. It might have been his rookie season. I think, that kind of shows you who Magic was. And maybe it's an argument for him to be even higher than number 8. So we'll leave people up to debate that. So with Bill Russell, greatest winner of all time. I think he's one of 3 guys on this list that, depending how you define the greatest of all time, he could be it if you mean greatest being winning. So I have him at number 7. The reason I have him above Russell above Bird and Magic, I think Russell's the greatest Celtic of all time. So I think he has to be above Bird. I guess that's open for debate, but I have a hard time seeing how you can be win 11 out of 13, be the player coach towards the end, and not be considered the greatest, at least in your franchise. So I have him over Bird for that reason. And then I have Kobe at number 6. I also have him as the greatest Laker of all time, though I'm sure that'd be up for debate. Another reason. I put him above Magic, even though I have Kareem above Kobe. Kareem obviously played with the Bucks for a while too. I think he won obviously 3 with Shaq, but 2 as really the main guy. Pau Gasol will be a Hall of Famer one day, but Kobe was just the guy. I think he's the 3rd greatest scorer when he was at his best of all time. Obviously a great defender, as you mentioned. I will say the argument against Kobe is, I looked this up, I think he had a 4% lower field goal percentage for his career than any of these other guys we're going to mention. So I think his efficiency as a scorer can be called into question. Maybe for some reason, I don't know if that's what people at ESPN would argue, putting him at number 9. I think he's definitely higher than that. I have him as the 6th greatest of all time.
So should we move on 1 to 5 or 5 to 1? We should go there now, and then we'll talk about the whole big picture after that.
Yeah, why don't you, since I just talked everyone's ear off, why don't you go ahead? Unless you want me to start, because you started last time, your choice.
Oh, I'm happy to go. I'm going to give you ESPN first. They had Magic at 5. Remember, they had Wilt at 6. Obviously, Wilt's going to be in our top 5. They had Russell at 4. You know, we talked all about him, 5 MVPs to boot. Kareem at 3, 6 MVPs. LeBron at 2. And Michael Jordan, you know, 6-time champion. I think there's always been an ESPN bias towards Michael Jordan. You'll recall, or maybe you were a little young, but in 2000 when they did that top 50 of all time, somehow Michael Jordan finished number 1 over Babe Ruth, which of course is laughable, especially where I come from, since, you know, Ruth was much better than Michael Jordan. As was Jim Thorpe, who, by the way, was voted over Ruth in 1950. So I always had troubles with that. And here, I think Jordan is right there at or near the top. I just don't think he's on Mount Rushmore, as you're about to find out from me. But I just don't think, you know, we'll get to him in a minute. Let me give you my 5 through 1. At 5, I have Kareem. 4, I have LeBron. 3, I have Michael Jordan. 2, I have Wilt. And 1 somehow missed the whole top 10. 1, I have Oscar Robertson, who you might guess I do want to talk about a little bit. So let me just talk about him briefly, then we'll get your 5, then we'll really go into it. It's almost like Oscar's the forgotten man. He played for the Cincinnati Royals most of his career, which is partly why he's the forgotten man. He had to play against Russell and Chamberlain his whole career, which is why he's the forgotten man. But not only did he average a triple-double, he actually got a lot of pub a few years ago. But not only did he average a lot of triple-double in his 2nd season, if you average out his points, rebounds, and assists in his first 5 years, here are his numbers. 30 for 5 seasons, 30.3 points, 10.4 rebounds, 10.6 assists. I think if you go out to 6 seasons, he averaged like 9.97 assists or something. That's something that nobody can even think about. We could talk about Westbrook later if you want. So that's why I have him at number 1. He's the greatest all-around player ever, period. You're not going to tell me a greater all-around player than Oscar. And the reason I put Wilt as number 2, because you could easily put Wilt as number 1, easily the most dominant player. If you dropped him in today's game, I know it's a different game with the 3-point lane, but physically, he'd still be the most dominant player ever. And his number is 54.4 points average for a season, 100 points in a game. Come on. And then the 1 year they criticized him for not, you know, passing the ball enough. He just decided to lead the league. He had most assists, you know, just for goofs. So I just give you 1, 2. We'll take your 5 through 1. But I wanted to get those guys in because they're numbers 6 and 11. Wilt is 6. And Oscar is 11, which is a joke on the ESPN, you know, top 74, whatever they did. What are your 5 through 1, Johnny? And then we'll, you know, bat them around a little.
Yeah, that sounds great. So my 5 through 1, I had a really hard time with number 5 and number 4. You'll be a little disappointed in me. I kind of split the difference between you and ESPN. I have Oscar as my number 5. I have Kareem as my number 4, Wilt as number 3, LeBron as number 2, and Jordan as number 1. And I won't get into them in too much detail. I mean, Oscar, I'm not quite with you, obviously. I think I'm more so than with most people my age. I'll put it like that. I think if you're naming the greatest backcourt of all time, it's Jordan and Oscar, no doubt. I'd also make a weird comparison, Oscar and LeBron, in terms of their career numbers. I went back, saw Oscar for his career. You're totally right about the triple-doubles. Nobody knew what a triple-double was back then, so Oscar would have averaged it for longer if they did, if it was given nearly the emphasis as it was today. He was 25.7, 9.5, 7.5 for his career. The only other person who's going to approach anything like that is LeBron in terms of career numbers, and he won't get to that 9.5 mark. But I will say him and LeBron are the only two guys, and I didn't see Oscar play, so you have to correct me if I'm wrong, who were almost pass first guys that averaged 25 for their career. I mean, there's no one else has done that. And that's pretty incredible to me. The reason I wanted to have him at number 4, I didn't. I think the NBA, if we're doing greatest NBA players of all time, it was a big man's game for most of a career still. I mean, that's going to change over the next few years as more and more years, come in with the not just the three-point line, but kind of the revolution in terms of shooting the basketball and moving out the bigs. But I just think we needed another big on there. So that's why I have Kareem. Happy to go, and I'll just say for Jordan as number 1, because I've thought about this. I think the gap is a lot closer than most people nowadays say it is. But I just view him not only as the greatest player of the 90s, I think he was the greatest individual talent of the 80s, even though he didn't win. Just go back and look at the highlights. I know you can't do that with Oscar and Wilt. Jordan was so far and above in terms of athleticism, in terms of scoring the basketball, in terms of defense. He really had it all. And I think that last sequence that we'll probably see on The Last Dance of him stealing the ball from Malone, who got it from Stockton, one of the greatest passers and the greatest post player in NBA history, just stealing it in that situation, taking it up. We can talk about whether it was a push-up, but hitting that shot as they were losing by 1, that just kind of sums it up in a way that no other player really has. So that's why I have him at number 1, but I'd like to go more into Wilt and LeBron, so we can open this up if you want.
Well, you go on, Wilt. Tell me what you think.
So Wilt I have at number 3. I just view him as both the greatest really scorer and rebounder in NBA history and the most dominant player. Even though I don't know if Jordan technically averaged more points per game than Wilt over his career. Wilt obviously became more of a rebounder and facilitator later in his career. But he's just the most dominant player of all time. He has to be on the top 4. He just has to be on basketball's Mount Rushmore. He did end up winning 2 titles, too, as part of one of the greatest teams in 66-67 as well that most people forget about in an era dominated, obviously, by Russell and the Celtics. LeBron, I think, is closer to number 1 than you think. If LeBron finds a way to win a title with the Lakers, winning a title with 3 teams even though he had, obviously, some level of help from Davis, Kyrie, and Wade going back to the Heat, the greatest player on 3 different sets of teams that all won the championship, it's hard to argue against. He's also probably going to be top 3 in both scoring and assists of all time by the time he's done. So I think the LeBron-Jordan debate, which I think it'll turn into, though I know you disagree, is going to turn into, well, how do you define greatness? Similar to, I guess, what you can say about Russell, too, if you define it just by winning. I think LeBron has a chance to be really great for a really long time, break a lot of records, and still win a couple more titles with a different franchise. I think that's going to be hard to argue against on some level in a few years from now.
Well, it cuts both ways for me on LeBron because we don't know if we're going to see the downturn of LeBron like you've seen for so many of these other players in the past. And I'll use my Oscar defense a bit, and that would be, nobody really ever talks about this, but the notion of what you have today where these guys are all gazillionaires, they all have private trainers, never question LeBron or Michael Jordan's work ethic. And I should separate them because they're, a long ways apart time-wise as well. But my goodness, I always wonder what Oscar would be like with the nutrition the way it is today, the training the way it is today. And frankly, I won't say the lack of racism, but Oscar grew up in a totally racist society in Indianapolis. It troubled him all through high school and through college at Cincinnati and into the pros. I'm not saying these guys today would be lesser players if they played back then. I'm just saying you don't know because you don't know what that kind of thing does to you. And Oscar overcame all of that. And I'll give you even one thing I saw, not relating to racism, but what I saw with Jordan, and you'll recall this, I think we talked about it, Johnnie. So they had the thing at the beginning, one of the first episodes, trivia. Only 2 people in the history of basketball have averaged more than 25 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists in their rookie season. Michael's one of them, and his numbers were like, I want to say, and I'm guessing now, but they were like 28, 7 rebounds and 6 assists or something like that. And then they said, who's the other one? And they told you right away, which I like about this for all the trivia. And the other guy was, of course, Oscar. So I went and looked up Oscar. What did he do his first year? Well, of course, he averaged 30 a game, and he averaged like 10.2 rebounds and 9.7 assists. So again, he almost averaged a triple-double as a rookie. So those two are the only two to ever do that. But they're quite different in the way they did it. Now you tell me, and of course I believe you, that LeBron, when he retires, is going to be one of the top 3 or 4 scorers. Do you mean on total points or average points?
I meant total points and total assists.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you right now, and I don't know where LeBron is, but he, will have to wait till he retires. But Oscar is the only guy to this day who remains in the top 10 all time in the NBA, scoring points and assists. And so, again, I always have to go to the stats because he played in the era of Russell and Chamberlain. Hard to, obviously, he won his title eventually with Kareem. He won an MVP in the mid-'60s, and in the 60s, the only 2 guys who won MVPs were Wilt or Russell. And then, of course, one year Oscar got in there. So I still think, excuse me, even today, you see these, Doncic became, I forget what he was. He became like the youngest guy with X triple doubles. And, and I'm sorry, he became the second. And Oscar had like twice as many as he did. Whenever they put up these records, he's there. I'll give you a funny one. The Greek Freak this year, Giannis Antetokounmpo, he had a 30-point triple-double on opening day. And they said the Greek Freak becomes the second player all time to have a 30-point triple-double on opening day. And the only other guy to do it with was Oscar Robertson. And, oh, by the way, he did it twice. So he just pops up on all these things. And some people will say, oh, those are statistics. He only won 1. And if ESPN killed Chamberlain or dropped him to 6 for 2, then maybe they'll say that's why Oscar only had 1. But as you know, it's a team sport. Stockton, Malone, Barkley, they never won anything. Nobody's going to say they're not all-timers. I understand they're not all top 10, but it's not because they didn't win titles. So I push hard for Oscar. I'm kind of losing the argument the older I get and the further away from the game he gets. I don't even mention, and this should not be part of the discussion, but he was the president of the Players Association, and the lawsuit that eventually led to all of these guys being gazillionaires, and Oscar wasn't even making a lot of money. So another factor, I know it doesn't count in here. For me, Jordan and LeBron are interesting. I'll be interested to see what you think of this, Johnny, and I'll throw it over to you. But both of them in the era of the three-point shot, and obviously more prevalent with LeBron than it was with Jordan because it came in the 80s, but still for most of his, I think most or all of his career, both of them are approximately 33% three-point shooters. So it's hard for me to make a case for them as the greatest players who ever lived. Both ferocious defenders. Some people think LeBron is a 6'8" Michael. As athletic as LeBron is, he's not as athletic as Michael Jordan. And I'll even say they're both probably better athletes than Oscar. But go watch some Oscar video. He was 6'5". He was strong as a bull. He backed you down and scored over you. It didn't matter who you were. And I don't think that would have changed, frankly. The final thing I'll say about Oscar is Dick Barnett, who was a star in those Knicks championship teams in the 70s, his number 12 is up in the rafters. He's still around New York. He's like in his 80s. And they interviewed him last year, and he said, the only thing I want to say about Oscar Robertson is if he wanted to, he could have scored 50 a game all the time. And that just shows you what kind of team player he is, along with the assist record that we've talked about. It was harder to get an assist back then, and nobody was rigging reboundings for him so he could get triple doubles. Over to you, Johnny.
Yeah, and I think those are all great points, and I try to. You may disagree, but I try and give Oscar his due. I think more so than most people who never saw him play. I'll put it like that. I think one of the problems is just kind of the elephant in the room, which is one NBA championship. And frankly, as essential as he was, probably was not the best player on the team when he won his NBA championship. A young Lou Alcindor, I believe, was probably considered the best player on that team. Not saying they would have won without Oscar, as Kareem never did on the books, besides having Oscar. But I think that's kind of the argument against him. Yes, they played against the 60s Celtics. I will say as an argument for Wilt, though I'm sure Wilt's team was better than Oscar's team in 66 and 67. Wilt did, he got over the hump of the Celtics and won. And Oscar, a lot of people, including me, I'll be honest, I shouldn't say that. I can't name a teammate of Oscar's when he played for Cincinnati. I don't think most people can name a teammate for Oscar's when he played for Cincinnati. And I think that's an argument in favor of Oscar for being, I would say, in the top 5 in NBA history for all that he accomplished, leading the league in assists 7 of his first 9 years. You can't even name a guy he was throwing the ball to. It's absolutely incredible. So I give him total credit. But the other thing is, when I was thinking of crafting kind of my Mount Rushmore, the top 4 of all time, I'm thinking I really need guys who are undoubtedly the best player of their era. And the 60s had a lot of talent, and I don't think you necessarily – I would put Wilt up there. If I had to say the best player of the 60s, even though Russell and the Celtics won, I think I need to go with Wilt. He was just too dominant. And then I transitioned to Kareem, 70s into the early 80s, as he was definitely the best player of the 70s. There's not a doubt about that. He won 6 MVPs. And then in the 80s, even though it was kind of Magic Bird's decade, I just encourage everyone to watch early Jordan highlights. It was incredible what he did. And if you are on the side of you can be the greatest without winning and going up against stiff competition, I think it's hard to discount not just Jordan from the 90s, but look at Jordan in the mid to late 80s. He was just so much better than anyone else on the court. He just had nobody to play with. And then I think obviously in the 90s, Jordan was far and away the greatest. And I think Kobe was probably the best in the 2000s, but for the most part, the last 2 decades, it's really been LeBron's league. And I just think he has to be up there as well. So that's kind of why I have those 2 as those 4 as my main 4. Oscar just misses the cut for me. Once again, I will emphasize, if you're looking for the greatest backcourt in NBA history, I think a lot of people would say Magic and Jordan. No, you got to go with Oscar and Jordan. Oscar was too good, not just too good of a passer, but he could really score at will. And I think that's the best backcourt. But I think in terms of the greatest ever, it's hard. I know we didn't see Oscar play in the 60s, but it's hard when you don't have that defining moment. I hate to say it. Even LeBron, I would say the block and defeating the Warriors, 73-9 Warriors, is a huge defining moment. Jordan, you can think of a lot, and I go back to just taking the ball away, not just scoring and over Brian Russell and defeating the Jazz, but stripping Malone on the other side. That really sums up Jordan's greatness in a nutshell. I'm sorry, in Game 6 of the finals in Utah, and really what was effectively, we can talk about the Wizards, but effectively his last game. That sums it up, and I just don't think anyone can really overcome that.
Well, one of the reasons I disagree on Jordan, beside his not very good three-point shooting, is who did he really beat in the 90s? So you can say Oscar correctly only won 1. You can say Wilt correctly only won 2. If you drop Michael Jordan into the 60s on one of those other teams, on the Cincinnati Royals, I don't think he's leading them past. I think Oscar lost in the playoffs like 5 or 6 times to the Celtics, and then also to the 76ers when Wilt got there. And so I don't even know what great team did Jordan beat in the finals. What great team? The 90s, it was the decade of Jordan. So, again, Russell won every year with 7 Hall of Famers. Happy to put him in the top 10. Some people will put him in the top 5. Greatest winner ever. But if you're Oscar and you're showing up to a gunfight with a cap gun. Mm-hmm. So how are you going to beat the Celtics? How are you going to beat Wilt? How are you going to win MVP? He won 1 MVP, the only guy in the 60s besides those guys to win MVP. So I understand what you're saying, and the athleticism is incredible. But I think there was almost a lack of competition. Bird and Magic, I think they did get translated higher because they were Bird and Magic. And that's probably why neither of them, well, I guess especially Bird, I think he's got 3. You know, if either one of them wasn't in the league those years, the other guy would have like, I don't know, maybe they'd have 7 or 8. Who knows? So part of it to me is the competition. Part of it is to me in the new world of the three-point shot. Neither of them were exceptional. You know, they showed the shrug when he hit 6 threes because he was angry that someone said Clyde Drexler was as good as him or something. But they beat a Portland team. I mean, didn't they beat the Phoenix Suns one year with Barkley as the MVP? I mean, who did they really beat? It wasn't the Celtics beating Wilt. So I just think that misses something. Although, again, you could say with the Oscar played in the 60s, so Jordan played 25, 35 years later. LeBron played 40, 50 years later. I'll say it again. If you could have switched those guys and Oscar could have had what all these guys had growing up especially when they got money early, would he have been even better? I don't know. Nobody knows. If you put him back then, would they have been even better? There's a whole different thing now when you get into the racial aspect of America in the 50s and 60s when Oscar grew up and became a superstar. So I think it's hard to compare. I like your numbers. I wish you put Oscar 4 because he's Mount Rushmore to me. But yes, maybe I'm a little biased. Of course, that's when I was a kid and I seem to be more influenced. Although Babe Ruth is the greatest baseball player. Jim Brown is the greatest football player, and I barely saw him. Although I know we'll do football and you might have a different selection, but we could do that another time. So my concluding remarks is I still stick with Oscar 1, Wilt 2, Michael 3. I think there's a chance LeBron can catch him, but I'll say it again. I don't know how much of a dip LeBron is going to have, but most of these guys at the end, including Wilt, including Michael, including Oscar, they had a dip at the end. I think LeBron, if he plays long enough because he wants to get more titles, will have a dip, but still his numbers are going to be incredible. So I'll stick with my top 5, and I'll chastise ESPN once more because if Oscar Robertson isn't in your top 10, I won't say you can throw the top 10 in the garbage can, but I will say it's incredibly flawed by not having him there. What are your final thoughts, Johnny?
My final thoughts, one on LeBron, is he very well may decline, but I think he has played at a higher level for a longer time already than anyone has in NBA history. We're going on, 17, 18 years, and he's arguably the MVP. He would have arguably been the MVP this year. We don't know what will have happened. And that'll be a talking point if they can't finish this season, what could have been with LeBron, because They were the best team in the league, period, I think. So I think that's the argument with LeBron very well may have a downfall, but he's already kind of done it in my mind. I think he needs to win one more to catch Jordan for me, or to be in that even kind of close to Jordan or right there with him. But he's kind of already done that from a longevity. I won't necessarily hold it against him if he declines at this point. I think everything you outlined with Jordan and the competition he faced on the 90s is the reason why I have him as number 1, but it's not as big of a gap and it's not as some sort of inevitable thing that everybody nowadays treats it to be. Because you're absolutely right. Jordan in the 90s never defeated a big 3. He never defeated a big 3. If he played in the 80s against Magic, Kareem, and Worthy, or against Bird, McHale, and Parrish, he would have won some. They would have won less, but he wouldn't have been undefeated. Or if he played later against the Spurs, against Shaq and Kobe, against the Warriors, he would have won a lot, but he wouldn't have been undefeated. And I think obviously in the 60s, you're totally right in terms of Russell. I have Oscar there in my top 5. I've had him on my Mount Rushmore forever. I just thought I should give more love to the big guys. Kareem also, we didn't talk about this. All 3 levels, he's probably the greatest player ever. We're just talking about NBA, but I think that counts for maybe something. So I'm going to stick with Jordan for now. I think LeBron can catch him, but I'll go to war with that top 5 any day of the week.
Well, the final thing I'll say on Kareem, and of course he's a Power Memorial guy like me, maybe I should give him some more credit, but when you talk about LeBron doing what he did at the highest level, I agree, but I'll throw Kareem into the mix. 19-time All-Star. He was a 15-time All-NBA player and 10 times first-team All-NBA player. So he's the one guy who comes to my mind. Although I do agree towards the very, very end, he was still really good. I don't know if he was, for example, what LeBron is this year. And you're right, he might get the shaft if they don't get a chance to play. I don't know if they're going to give out league awards if they stop the season. But you're right, he probably is the MVP this year. And I didn't think he would be. I thought Kawhi had surpassed him in the last couple of years. We can argue about that some other time. And I think you made some good points about Durant as well, because he is the best next guy, although I'm going to reserve judgment on Kawhi to see what both of these guys do in the next 5 years.
Steve, can I make a point? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
I just want to make, and feel free to respond and take the last word. I made a point earlier. I went through all 10 of these guys, and we have 9 out of the 10 same guys, and I think it kind of applies across MJ and LeBron were undoubtedly the best player on their teams their entire career. Even though LeBron has had some help and Jordan obviously had Pippen, I don't think that's in question. I think that could also be true with Russell, though he had 7 Hall of Famers, so it's a little harder argument when you have 7 Hall of Famers. It might be true with Bird. I know injuries ended his career early, so he could be another guy. But I think MJ and LeBron are kind of unique in that sense, as they were, you look at Wilt. Wilt was not the best player on the Lakers when he was there. You look at Kareem. He was, him and Magic were both great, but eventually Magic was the best player on that team, obviously, especially as Kareem got older. And also with Oscar, as much as I love him, he was not the best player when they won the championship. And I'll give you a time to respond to that. But I do think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. I just want to throw that out there. MJ and LeBron, over the course of their careers, were undoubtedly the best player on their respective teams.
No, I think all those are good points. I don't have a response to that. The other thing I'll say as pro LeBron is he took Cavalier teams to the finals. His record in the finals is not going to be good. But some of the teams he took were just not good. I mean, he gets more props from me, even though he lost a bunch of them. Now, everyone will say the East wasn't good, etc. And it wasn't that the East was terrible. It was they weren't as good as the West. But a few of those teams that he took to the finals had no business even going far in the playoffs, in my opinion. And you always saw when LeBron left how bad the teams he left became and how just leaving them flipped. Whatever you think of Jordan when he left and played baseball, the Bulls that next year, they were unbelievable. I think they won 60 games. And so, but your points are well taken about LeBron and MJ versus the other guys. And the other thing that's interesting to me, not that a three-point shot would have affected Wilt or Russell. I don't even know, being honest about Oscar. Now, if you had a three-point shot, Oscar probably would have been a really good three-point shooter. But if you watch Oscar film, as opposed to Jerry West, another guy who just, I love Jerry West, who would have been one of the greatest three-point shooters ever if they put up a line in the NBA. I don't know if Oscar would have been a great three-point shooter, but I do think if you're looking at everybody's overall game, Oscar and Michael Jordan and LeBron, they're just, I don't even know if 33% is average, Johnny. And it might have been the average I'm sure was lower when Michael played. We'll talk another time about the development of the three-point and Steph Curry and how he's changed the game and the analytics of the modern day world that says you're a dope if you take a mid-range jumper to get 2 when you could step back and take a 3. I don't agree with that. We'll talk about that another time. But all your final points are well taken, and I would even give LeBron a plus for the teams he's taken to the finals, because 50 years from now, somebody will say, oh, he only won 3 and he lost, what did he lose, 5 or whatever he lost. Yeah. And that's just unfair the other way. So wonderful discussion. Great doing it with you, Johnny. This is Steve Kallas, sports editor of WestchesterCountyPost.com, along with new contributor Johnny Kallas. We'll see you the next time.